Welcome to the Sons of Mjolnir podcast.
The Sons of... what?
This isn't your Sons of Macaroni, yeah!
The Sons of Mjolnir?
This is Sons of Mjolnir, yeah!
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Sons of Mjolnir. As always, I am one of your hosts, Fat Thor, and today I am joined by a very special guest. You may know him as the writer of books such as The Game, The Adept, and How I Slept My Way Through College, and other tales from freshman year, and probably most notably the books of White Ash, and then now its spin-off Glarien, which the first issue was actually one of the most backed Kickstarter issues ever. I am joined today by Charlie Stickney. Charlie, thank you so much for coming on and nerding out with me today. I'm super excited to have you.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. I love the concept for this show. I think it's really much in the theme of some of the things I'm building in White Ash. So I'm, excited to sort of add to what you're already doing.
Beautiful. And like I said, we're so happy to have you. We were lucky enough to read some of Glarien that you sent us for this interview. And it's one of those things, like, I'm almost embarrassed to say that I'm just now jumping on because I really, really enjoyed it. I'm a huge mythology, obviously, as Fat Thor, mythology nerd and fantasy and all that stuff. And I just really love the world that you've created here with White Ash and Glarien. So I am just super excited to get all into the nitty-gritty nerdy stuff with you today.
Well, thanks. I think that's one of the hardest things for independent comics, even when they're coming out from larger publishers. And White Ash came out for a while through Scout Comics.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, it was on Kickstarter, and now we've kind of gone back to Kickstarter. It's finding that audience and building upon it. And where I am really fortunate is that over time, we have continually been able to grow that audience.
Mm-hmm.
To the point where, yes, in terms of like single issue series on Kickstarter, Glarien is one of the biggest that comes out on a regular basis, and White Ash is right up there too. So we have a huge following on Kickstarter where we're a top 10 brand. Eventually we'll be moving that back into the direct market. And maybe down the road, we'll see. These things there may be other forms of White Ash and Glarien coming out in other media. So
Well, I'm excited for all of it. Like I said, now that I'm in the world, you fully grabbed me, my friend. I am fully in the world of White Ash. So wherever it's coming out from, publisher or Kickstarter, I am fully on board. But before we get into all the great stuff about Glarien and the world that you've created, I kind of want to start off and take a step back a little bit and talk a little bit about your origin story, if you would. So something we typically do on the show is kind of talk about people's comic origin, how they got into the media. And yours was very interesting to me just because I felt like I related to it very, very much. You talk about that as a kid, you were a very avid collector of Marvel books specifically.
yeah.
And everyone who watches or listens to our show knows that we joke around that we're the Marvel boys and all that. And you also talked about getting into Batman stories, and that was another thing that really grabbed you, which again, that was another thing that really grabbed me. So I guess my question on top of all of that, you're collecting Marvel, the Batman's really getting into you. Do you remember some of maybe the specific storylines and or maybe issues that really started that collective bug, if you would?
Sure. And I'm a child that grew up in the 80s, born in slightly before the 80s. But for me, Transformers were kind of my gateway drug back to comics. I always had a few issues just lying around in a box on the floor, but I was collecting Transformers. I picked up a 3-pack of Transformer comic books, and in it I saw Spider-Man was in the black costume when he was battling Megatron in like the second issue, which was crazy, a weird crossover anyway. I don't know really what they were trying to do there, but it worked.
Comics, baby.
Yeah. And so like I had to find out why he was in that black costume. So I went to the bookstore and I picked up Amazing Spider-Man 287, which was the middle of this gang war series that was happening. And it was interesting, and Daredevil standing over him with his billy club saying like, "Stay down, Spider-Man." I was like, who is this Daredevil? What's going on? And I quickly got hooked in because honestly, like on the heels of that was one of the best little runs of Spider-Man in the late 80s, early 90s, which was the Craven the Hunter, Death in the not Death in the Family, Craven's Last Hunt storyline.
Yeah.
You
Ooh,
know,
such a great story.
like
Such a
so
great one.
basically, like within like 5 months of me collecting comics, that dropped, and you know, it was kind of terrifying and horrifying, and then that followed up with like another little mini crossover where Spider-Man was in an insane asylum, was like the Mad Dog something or other.
Hmm.
And you know, so then I was like picking up some Spectacular Spider-Man and Web, and I was getting really immersed into the world. And then this young artist who was trying to do some crazy things with webs, Todd McFarlane, took over the book.
Oh,
And
that guy. I think I've heard of him before.
yeah, and then they introduced this character Venom, and so like that was like my formative time getting into comics.
Mhm.
And then I was like, well, what is this Todd McFarlane? What else has he done? Oh, he did this run on the Incredible Hulk. So I picked that up, and then I got into the Incredible Hulk, and then there was a crossover with the X-Men. So like, and then like you know, a year later, I was getting 50 titles a month.
Yeah,
So
just
you
snowballed and snowballed.
so quickly, but it was also a great time because you had Chris Claremont at the height of his game. You had
Hmm.
Peter David taking over his run on the Incredible Hulk. You had all that amazing stuff going on with Spider-Man, and you had the artist revolution, and then you had like Todd McFarlane, and then you had Jim Lee coming, you know, like, and so it was a really exciting time in comics.
Yeah.
And I loved that whole space, and I love being part of it, and I love going to conventions. I remember one of my first conventions I went to was at the Something Cloud Inn in Dover, New Hampshire,
Hmm.
and I'm walking through there, and this creator behind a table was like, "Hey, John, Charlie." I was there with my friend John, and I'm like, "How does he know who we are?" And he's like, "Guys, you got name tags." I was like, "Oh yeah," and he's like, "Come on, come check out my comic, The Tick." And it was Ben Udland, and he
Oh,
had like 3 issues of The Tick done. And so like getting into that, like right at the time when that was just still a super indie comic, that opened my eyes that there was more than Marvel and DC.
hmm.
And there was also a presentation on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles there. So I was kind of getting into the underground scene at that time. And then when I got to college, sometimes I think, at least for me, I was getting past the point where I wanted to read something that was curated IP, and by that I mean, you know, someone is there as a steward to make sure that the character doesn't really change that much, and but it does every couple of years when a new writer comes on. And so like the Spider-Man that I had fallen in love with, the Incredible Hulk that I'd fallen in love with, they weren't really quite feeling the same thing with the
Hmm.
X-Men. There was a shift from Claremont to Scott Lobdell, and so like everything was shifting. And for me, that was at the time when Dark Horse was just sort of breaking. And you know, until you had like Frank Miller with Sin City, you had Mike Mignola with Hellboy, and all these things were just starting. And so that was really interesting. And I kind of shifted over to collecting pretty much Dark Horse. Oh, and then like this obscure Vertigo line that was doing starting the series called Sandman. You know, like these
Man,
crazy things. So
you're on
it
the
was,
ground floor of all the greats, man.
yeah, so it was like it was an interesting time, but it was also like my evolution going from, you know, the traditional superheroes, and then sort of
Hmm.
giving some of that up to like the early wave of independent creators. I mean, Images also launched that time, but I'll be honest, like I picked up a couple of those early issues of the Image books, but as a future writer, I was more interested in the writing of comics, and especially the first 2 years of Image. If you go back, those books are not about the writing. They're
Hmm.
about the art, and the art is brilliant. And it was, you know, artists cut loose in a way they hadn't been before. But like the characters weren't as fleshed out as they would be. You know, here we are 20 years later, or 25 years later, and Spawn's still going. You know, and like
Yeah.
there's a rich tapestry for all of those characters now. But at the time, there really wasn't. That pushed me into, you know, like the Dark Horse and the Vertigo for a while. So like I was doing that after college, and then you graduate from college, and you reach this point where you're trying to figure out life. And when I was in college, it was a question of, do I go down into to be a comic book writer or an inker? I went to college in upstate New York, so it was like, do I move to New York City and do that? But I was also a film major, and I got a job offer in LA for films. So it was like the two different paths. What do I do? I moved out to LA, you know, was a struggling artist for a long time. So comic books kind of had to go.
Yeah.
Just like food was more important at the time, and the crazy
Food
LA rent.
comics.
I know, I know. And so I kind of dropped out of the comic scene for a while, and then things started taking off for me, and I worked in animation for a while. I've worked in feature film, I've worked in documentary, I've worked as a writer, a producer, an editor of a lot of different things. But in the mid aughts to like 2010, the entertainment industry was also starting to change. Everything was becoming more based on IP. Iron Man had come out, and that was kind of changing, the big blockbusters. And so they were cutting back on the kind of films I had come up wanting to make, which were more like genre-based romantic comedies, like Groundhog Day, Serendipity, Click, like those kind of fun things that they were doing back in the day, but they weren't making that kind of movie anymore. It was these huge blockbusters, or the interesting stuff was being done in television. And shifting to television just seemed like a crazy pivot for me, even though I had worked in animation. And I reached a sort of a tipping point where I was like, why am I killing myself to try to do these things when everyone keeps saying, we just want something that's based on a comic book? And I was like, I could just make comic books.
Yeah, cut out the
It's like
middleman of the
it's
equation.
been a long time, but like that was what I wanted to do. And so around 2014, 2015, I started sort of putting plans into motion. And I was talking with my wife, and I was like, you know what? I mean, maybe we could look for a publishing deal. I do have some credits as a writer, but I don't know, the publishing deals don't look great. How much money could we afford to invest and do it on our own? So we started like having these long conversations, and I was looking at the state of the industry. And independent comics are and have always been a labor of love. But if you're coming in as a newer creator, you have to really be careful. And I personally am lucky in that I've had a long time being on the other side, where I prepare budgets, and I've written contracts for animation and for film and things like that. So I know the things to look for. I know how accounting is done. And I was looking at the state of the industry, and this was, like I said, around 2015 at this point, 2016, and I was thinking, what I want to do is I want to build this White Ash universe, and which they always tell you, don't, like, start small, get a series done. But I was like, I want to do this thing that could be like a 60 issue series with spin-offs, or it could be a TV show that could run for 5 years, or it could be like, I wanted to build this big thing because I had the experience of being a professional writer for years and years, and I had it planned and I had it plotted. But looking at traditional publishing, I was like, even if I landed a publishing deal, they're going to give me 4 issues. Even if you go to a place like Image, and I was looking at the numbers, because back then the numbers were more readily available. The number of creators who get past issue 6 in a series who don't have a name in comics is almost non-existent, right? And so to be able to get the retailers to buy in, to get to the numbers that it'd be enough so it would pay for the series, it just wasn't happening. And so I'm like, is this worth it? Is it worth jumping into this? And then, like, through all of those just conversations, I found Kickstarter, and it was still a little bit of the Wild West. And I was like, well, if we do something here and it catches on, and at that time, people really weren't serializing books through Kickstarter. It was mostly anthologies, it was trades, it was one shots, because people were looking at a project as you do this thing and then you kind of walk away. But there were like 1 or 2 books that were doing it. There was this one series, Skies of Fire, which is great, has beautiful art. I was like, oh, that looks like a great comic book. That looks like something that would stand up on the stands. I was like, okay, so people are doing it here. Let's try it. And the first issue of White Ash did well. Well for Kickstarter, especially for someone coming to it fresh. And we just kept building on there. And over, since 2016, we built up a massive fan base. We built up a huge following over there. And I found that it's just an amazing place to be able to connect with fans, to tell stories, to be able to raise enough money to hire the best artists, to work with some of the best in the industry, and pay them as much or as more than a lot of major publishers are paying. And we can do all that through Kickstarter and also own the rights, and know that we can keep doing this. And I think that, you've taken I've taken control of things in a way where I know if I want to, I can do this for another 10 years and keep telling these stories. So you can plot things out for things to drop in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road. So, I'm just very happy and very fortunate at how everything has worked out for me in the comic space.
And I mean, yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, hearing your kind of relationship with comic books and how you kind of were, again, like I said, you were on the ground floor for some of the, legendary stories of comics. I mean, with Spider-Man in the black suit and then Spawn and the Tick, like you were right there. And I think it was also interesting how you, like, your taste kind of went with the medium, right? Like you said, you started getting in indies with Sandman, like, which, everyone knows Sandman's probably one of the biggest indie books out there, and one that really opened people's eyes to, like you were saying, there are really great books outside of the big two. So that's just super interesting to hear about. And I also wanted to ask you too, you touched on this a bit about working in film and TV and animation and stuff like that. What would you say, I guess, one, what is the biggest thing that you learned from that side of your career coming into comics? And also, what would you say is the biggest difference between writing a comic script as opposed, let's say TV, just to make it, more structured, like an episode of TV versus an issue of a comic book?
Sure. I will, just preface this by saying, like, writing for every medium is different.
Hmm.
There's a big difference between writing for feature film versus writing for television versus writing for animation. And I'm fortunate that I've been able to adapt what I do to the different things. And I think part of that also goes back to my background and working as an editor, because
Hmm.
for a lot of these things, it's about rhythm, it's about pacing, it's about how to present information in a way that fits that particular medium in terms of how it conveys information. And all of that comes back to sort of understanding the rhythm and pacing of things.
Hmm.
Um, you know, for me, coming from film, I think one of the things that you learn is collaboration, because no film is made in a vacuum. There are
Hmm.
very few films that are made where you have the auteur who's like, this is how it is. The Quentin Tarantinos who turn in their script saying you can't alter a word are Quentin Tarantino and maybe, like, I don't know, Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, just a
So,
short, it's a short list.
like, I've been through the studio development system where they're like, we love this idea, about these two young guys. We can't cast that though. Can you make these two young guys in their 20s, one guy in their 30s? Instead of being set in New York, can you make it a road trip and go across the country? I'm like, I can. That's
I
a different movie.
guess.
But, like, and just learning to sort of work with people under the confines of what they're trying to figure out.
Hmm.
Like what they can do. And so if you come into film with, especially as a writer, if you're feature film, with the attitude of like, what I have written is the word, you're not going to work in feature film for very long.
Yeah.
And the same thing in TV, which again is a collaborative medium. There are very few people who can Aaron Sorkin things where they write all the episodes of The Wet Swing by themselves, right? In traditional TV writers' room, you have a showrunner who's there to really write the pilot and write 1 or 2 episodes of the year. And then he works with a team, or she works with a team of anywhere from 10 to 20 writers. And they break down the episodes and they have discussions about how everything should function. And then writers go off and write it, and then the showrunner will help put it together. But it's a big collaborative approach to telling a story. And so I think, like, that for comics is so important,
Hmm.
especially if you're a new writer, if you're coming to comics. And I try to tell this also to my friends from film and television. Please don't come in thinking because you wrote this script, you are the creator of this, right? You have to, their script is but a blueprint, a template for something that you're going to build.
Hmm.
And you're going to build that with some artist. And so it's a collaboration. And the minute it stops being a collaboration, you're not going to create something great. Because I don't care how good of a writer you are or how good of a visual sense you have. If you start dictating and stop collaborating, you're going to lose the essence of what makes comics its own medium. And so like that's a really important transition for any writer coming in, to know you need to collaborate, you need to trust your artist, you need to know that you're working together, that your artist is going to have strengths and weaknesses just like you do as a writer, and
Hmm.
hopefully you're finding someone who can balance that out, and together you can make something that's greater than the sum of the parts. And so like I think that's a really important mind space that you need to be in as a creator when you come to comics. In terms of like other things that you really need to understand, is you need to sort of dive into the medium and see what makes comics unique. And there are a couple of things, I mean, just off, the top of my head, like page turns,
Hmm.
um, knowing how, and some of this is changing a little bit in terms of how people consume things with digital media. But like if you go back to the physical, like there are actual physical things that can alter your perception of how you are ingesting the story. And so taking advantage of those tools that are inherent to that medium is so important. You have to understand pacing, you have to understand how panels can dictate tempo and rhythm, because that's not something that you have in other writing,
Hmm.
right? You have to choosing what dialogue lands on what beat. And this is where, for me, it goes back to that film editing background, where you're thinking about, when am I cutting, when am I not cutting, right? And how many actions you can have happen in one panel and make it readable. What do you need to do to speed things up, to slow things down? So like all of that expansion of time, compression of time. And if you go and you like, Will Eisner, one of the masters, has this
Hmm.
great, I mean, that's the other thing. Like I in the 80s, someone who was like a friend of the family gave me a stack of old Spirits magazines from the 70s. And if you haven't read the Spirit, it's this amazing strip that was started in the 40s, and then reprinted.
Classic.
Yeah, and Will Eisner was, light years ahead of so many of his contemporaries, and he wrote some of the first graphic novels, or the first, formal graphic novels that were called graphic novels, and he helped codify a lot of the language of visual storytelling, and parse it out so other people could understand it. I mean, for me, Eisner in many ways is like Orson Welles. You can go back and you look at Citizen Kane, and some of it, yes, feels dated. But you also, if you take a step back and you look at those techniques, there's so many of them that are still being used today in terms of storytelling and traditions and light and shadows. And Will Eisner was doing that stuff in the 40s.
Hmm.
And in the 70s, he had this book called Sequential Storytelling, where he talks about how to show time in a static medium. And that's such an
That's
interesting
super
concept.
interesting.
And like he's breaking it down, and he's like, here are some, like, even little tricks, like having a candle burning in the background so you can track pay time by how much the candle has melted, like from panel
Hmm.
to panel, how much time has passed, things like that, water dripping. Like, there are, like, he's like, think of ways that, if you need it, that you can show how much time has passed, because that is something that's harder to show in comics, where you can expand and compress the moment. But there are ways, like tricks and guides, but it's also just something to think about and be conscious of. And then a lot of that is our tricks for artists. But as a writer, you need to be cognizant of that as well. How are you expressing time in a static medium?
Hmm. Wow, that is so interesting. I love hearing about the kind of, nitty gritty details and differences that go into, like you were saying, making comics versus TV and movies. We had a couple horror writers on recently for spooky season, and something I found interesting, which I think, you touch on as well, is how, in a horror movie, a big thing is the score, like the music to add the jump scares and stuff. But when you're writing a horror comic, you obviously don't have that. So just hearing, like I said, the different toolboxes that you have to work with in different mediums, I think is just so fascinating. I could sit here and talk to you about that all day. But I got to ask you really quickly, because I mean, this could be a whole other episode worth of conversation.
Sure.
But with your experience in film, animation, TV, and then obviously in comics, I'm very curious with what is your kind of thoughts on, we're living in the age of the comic book movie, and you even touched on this a little bit in your experience when in 2010, I think you said, that was like off the heels of Iron Man, everyone wants these huge IPs. So I'm just curious, again, very quickly, again, this could be a whole topic of discussion for another episode, But what are your thoughts of the kind of age of comic book movies that we live in and some of the benefits and maybe drawbacks of that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I need to sort of again preface this with what I grew up with, was the the age of the death of the comic book movie, right?
Hmm.
Like we had, like when I was really little, we had Superman, and that Christopher Reeve Superman, which was amazing.
Yeah,
And then there
the
then there was,
best.
by like the third, like that their wheels had fallen off that franchise, and everything else for a long time was terrible.
Hmm.
Marvel was doing these atrocious movies that went direct to video, including the Fantastic Four.
I would
That
say you didn't like that Fantastic Four, man. Come
I
on.
I got to see that Fantastic Four when Sergio Aragones, the guy who does Gru
Hmm.
and a bunch of things, brought it in. And when I was interning at Marvel, into the bullpen, and I watched it with him and some other people, and they were doing like a Mystery Science Theater 3000 of it, because at that time it was bootleg. This was before the
Yeah.
internet, and there was no way to see that film. And so like Marvel did not have a good film until probably 2000 with X-Men, or I guess Amazing, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man kind of changed some things, right?
Hmm.
So like Marvel didn't have a good superhero film until the mid to late 90s. And so I grew up with horrible Marvel films and an occasional Batman film that was good, until they decided that superheroes weren't working anymore and would scuttle that for a while, right?
Hmm.
Um, so for me, this is a magical era where all the content is just out there. And and you can argue whether, oh, this Marvel movie is good, this one's not as good, but you're getting like 8 Marvel movies a year. You
Yeah.
have TV shows, you have high budget productions of all of these things. DC is killing it with their animation. Like some of their TV
Hmm.
shows are pretty good. Their movies, like debatable whether you like them or not. Some people love them, some people don't. But we
Hmm.
we are in a sea of content, and that's wonderful, especially for a big two fan. There are some other things that are being created on the comic book side. uh it's not been quite as good.
Hmm.
And I'll say this, sort of stepping back, looking at what's happening right now, to some of the comic book shops. And the comic book shops in general are a business model that's based upon revenue generated by the big two. That's how they arose. The ones that have been around forever, almost all of their customers are based on Wednesday Warriors,
Hmm.
right? And depending on the store, their non-Marvel or DC sales might be anywhere from 5% to, at a big indie store, maybe 25%. But for most of it, like the revenue is Marvel and DC. And what this explosion of film has done is it's created more places for people to see that content. And I think if you are a young person right now, and by that I mean you're someone in elementary school or middle school, the multimedia version is so exciting
Hmm.
and so well done. There's less incentive to go to the comic book shops to get these stories. Whereas when I was growing up, those were the only places
Yeah.
you could find those stories. And so I think that is impacting the comic book industry, combined with the fact that the success of these movies set off a speculator boom in the investment companies, where they're like, oh my goodness, there's so much money to be made in comics. Look at the Avengers that just made like $8 billion or whatever it is. We need to find the next one. And so all of these investment companies tried to find some comic book people to start up new publishers. And they dumped in a lot of investment money into creating these new publishers. So like 2014 through 2010, we had an explosion of the small publisher. And
Hmm.
all this new indie content came in and started flooding the shops, which is great because there were jobs for creators and there were opportunities for artists and things like that. However, normally in a market expands based on what fans, what the market will bear, right? You don't put out 8 different types of apples if there aren't people coming in who love apples and who are going to pick up all 8 types of apples, because the apple salesman will go out of business, right? Unfortunately, in comics, you had all these publishers coming in who were chasing that golden lottery ticket, like they've seen with the Avengers, and their revenue was not tied to how well their books were doing in the stands, right? Their
Mm-hmm.
revenue was based on the investment money that they got from these investors to create an Avengers. So over the last like 5 years in particular, the market has become flooded with way too much content because there was all this money pumped in to find the next Avengers. And then shortly, as the pandemic was winding down and interest rates were going up, these companies were finding that they weren't getting, that wasn't happening,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then they're looking for their investment back. And so what we've found right now is like now these companies are having that spigot turned off. And there's a lot of smaller publishers that are in trouble because of this. And the same thing is true for a lot of comic book shops who were trying, because they figured, oh, there must be a market for all these books. So they were buying them all,
Mm-hmm.
and, and not able to return them. So a lot of shops have overexpanded. And so what we are seeing right now, and sadly it's going to happen probably over the next year to 2 years, is a contraction of the marketplace to the size that it's actually sustainable. And that's going to mean some publishers are going to go away. It means some shops are going to go away. Does not mean comics are going to go away. Comics are constantly evolving, and
Mm-hmm.
what kind of context comics people are interested in are constantly evolving. But all of this goes like, I love all the media, but if you look downstream to see what it's done to comics, rather than buttressing and lifting up comics and being like, oh, the movies are doing well, the comics must be doing well. I think it's just taken some of the wind out of the sails. It's pushed a lot of investors into comics who shouldn't have been there. And
Mm-hmm.
so overall, the market has been hurt by it. The comic shops and the smaller publishers. And even like Marvel and DC as publishing companies have been hurt a little bit. That doesn't matter because for them, they're owned by larger conglomerates that are making money hand over fist through their movies and other things. So they're fine. They're, Marvel and DC, no matter what you hear, are going to be 100% fine.
Yeah.
They make
And
more money than God.
yeah, and that's kind of the reason I wanted to ask you about it, because I mean, this has been going on, I would probably since Iron Man, the first Iron Man, but I feel like especially right now, these past couple weeks with the Marvels coming out, the hit pieces have been on an all-time high of like, oh, Marvel is dead and is Marvel dying and stuff. So again, I just thought you would have a very interesting perspective given your, professional
Yeah,
history.
yeah. Like, look, you have to look at all the channels of revenue these companies are
Hmm.
bringing in. And Marvel is part of Disney, and Disney has Disney Plus, and so there's that revenue subscription, and there's the merchandising, and there's the toys, and like at the end of the day, a multi-billion-dollar company, some years will make less billions, and some years will make more billions.
If it's
And
still
like
making
yeah,
billions.
they're still making
Yeah.
billions. So like and we are in a time of hot takes and outrage
Hmm.
and polarization of politics and tribalism, and everyone wants to kind of jump on something. And there was an article that was recently on ICV, which a comic book shop retailer was talking about how it's diversity in comics that's causing sales to fall. And no, it's not. It's also like if you're a comic shop and you only sell Marvel and DC, I think you're being short-sighted because down the road things are changing. Manga is becoming a bigger part of things, and if you want to attract the next generation of readers, it's not going to be Marvel and DC. That's probably going to be, being 80 to 90% of your shop's revenue 20 years from now if you still have a shop, right?
Yeah.
Like I could see that 80 to 90% being 50 to 60% as all the other forms of comics rise up to take the place, and again form that special community that was always in a comic book shop when I was growing up, where it
Hmm.
felt special. This is the place where you go to get this kind of content that only you know about, that you can
Hmm.
only find here. And if these other stories can be found everywhere, it's the stories that can't be found everywhere that give these shops intrinsic value because they are the place you can find this stuff.
100%. And I mean, we are huge proponents over here for our local comic shops. And I think you make a really good point as well that I never really considered. I guess I've always been under the kind of assumption of, like you touched on, the movies are so big, and it makes everything so big, that I always thought that would push people to the stores, because they're like, oh, like I really enjoyed Guardians, like I want more of that, so like let me go find more. But I think you make a very great point in the sense of, since the movies are so good, which I know is subjective, but at least I think we can all agree they're made very well, and they're such a big spectacle, that I think you again make a great point that a lot of younger kids these days probably aren't as pressed to go and find a comic book or read about it, because there is just so much content. Like, especially right now, you could spend months just going through all of the Marvel stuff before you even touched a comic book. And I'm still relatively a young man, but when I was a kid, it was the same way. Like, if I wanted more Spider-Man stuff, I had to go to the comic shop. If I wanted more Batman, I had to go read about it. And I think that is a dying kind of art form right now.
Well, and I think like if you just to your point, like if you wanted more Spider-Man right now, right? You have so many of the big
Everywhere.
Spider-Man movies, right? Like
Hmm.
you can do like the classic ones, you can do the recent ones, but also if you go to Disney Plus, how many different Spider-Man cartoons are on there,
Yeah,
right?
a
Like so
hundred
if you want
percent.
like if
Yeah.
you come off the movies and you want more Spider-Man cartoons, you have like 100 different episodes of half-hour cartoons, and you can even go back to like the cartoon I watched when I was younger, which was Spider-Man and His Amazing
I
Friends,
would say
and they have
Amazing
like,
Friends. Yeah.
yeah, like
Hmm.
all those seasons are on there and they're still fun, and then
Yeah,
you
a
can sort of
hundred
get into
percent.
it. So like I just see like the movies pushing people into that.
Yeah.
Like you watch Love Guardians of the Galaxy, well, there's the Groot cartoon, you
Hmm.
can watch that, right? Or
Yeah.
you can watch some of the others. So like there's so much multimedia content, the animated versions, the TV shows, the movies that you can get for free, especially if your parents have a subscription, versus you having to spend money and you have to go somewhere, because I think kids don't go places as much anymore. Also,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
so like and I can find my community online. I don't need to go
Hmm.
find a group of strangers in a shop where
That's
we share a
another,
common interest.
really great point. Yeah, another really great point I didn't consider.
So like for all those reasons, particularly when it comes to big two content, I think the availability of so much, and look, if you watched Iron Man and you love that, I mean, the comics can be well written, but it's not you know oh, now I'm blanking on the actor, Robert Downey Jr.,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
It's not Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah.
It is hard to replicate Robert Downey Jr. on a page. I mean,
Hmm.
he is a singular force unto himself. Even in those movies, sometimes he stands out, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a couple of those actors who they are just so charismatic, you want to watch them no matter what. And so when you're used to that, and like when you're used to looking at the sun, looking at a flashlight doesn't have the same kind of feel. And I'm not saying that the movies are better, because
Yeah.
I'm not, but
No,
I'm
I get
saying that,
what you're throwing down for sure.
yeah. So it just, I think especially for kids who are used to a certain level of something, sometimes going to the comic, and it's also a transition of how you consume and everything. Yeah,
Yeah.
it just becomes harder and harder, I think, for those stories to measure up the better the multimedia versions become.
100%. And I think Tony Stark is probably the best example of that. Cause I mean, Robert Downey, he just took that character to a whole different stratosphere. I'd say all the time, and this is how I can tell like people were not reading comics before, the MCU and all this stuff. Cause I tell people all the time, Iron Man was not an A-lister before the MCU. Like, I would even go as far as like D list character, which don't get me wrong, he has his fans. I was a fan of Iron Man, but the character Tony Stark as a character in the comics is much, much different pre 2008 than it is
Yes.
afterwards. So I think, like you said, Tony Stark's probably the best example of that. And I agree, it is kind of hard, especially, we're comic nerds, so we know this stuff. But if I never read an Iron Man comic and then I go and read some of the, the Stan and Jack stuff, it's going to be way, way different.
Right. And like the other thing to remember is the entire MCU was built on the characters they still had the rights to.
Yeah,
because they
the
had
bottom of the
licensed off
barrel.
all their popular characters, right? Like for me, when I was growing up, if you looked at the charts, every single like the charts were dominated by X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman, and whatever Wolverine was crossing over into.
Yeah.
Right? Like you had to go to the 50th ranked comic usually to find an Avenger.
Or Captain America or
Yes,
Iron
yeah,
Man.
yeah,
Like, yeah.
exactly.
But I mean, again, we could do a whole episode just on this topic because we could go on. And I think your insights on this are just super, super interesting, and you have such amazing points. But let's start talking about some of your work. We're talking about all these
For sure.
comics and all the superheroes and all this stuff. Let's talk about your work. So let's start off with White Ash. So again, I'm a super big fan of this world that you've created here, and being a big fantasy nerd that I am, I'm curious. I got to ask, what was kind of the spark that started? Because obviously you're working with a huge world here with mythology and creatures and all this kind of stuff. So what was the kind of original spark for this idea, and what were some of your, I guess, fantasy influences on this work? Like, just for an example, I'm sure that you're a fantasy nerd as well. Like Tolkien, for example, very much into the world building aspect and, creating this whole mythology. But then on the other hand, you have someone like George R.R. Martin, who also creates a great world in mythology, but more focused on characters and the characters' relationships. So, again, how would you say that the spark of Glarien came from, and what kind of influences did you draw from?
Sure. And probably just I should step back because there may be people who have watched the show that don't know White Ash, that don't know Glarien. Like the quick log line on White Ash is I like to say Romeo and Juliet meets Lord of the Rings in rural Pennsylvania. So it's modern day fantasy set in coal mining country. And then Glarien is the origin story of the world's most dangerous elf, told through the eyes of a young woman in 1970s New York who's having visions of being this elf warrior from 3,000 years ago. And over the course of that mini series, those two stories are going to come together. You're going to find out how those two women are connected. It's also going to pay off a piece of the past of White Ash. It's all one big connected universe. And Glarien is a little bit more beyond being the origin story of Glarien. I'm using the Glarien character and some of her history to show the flashbacks of basically how things came to be in White Ash. White Ash is the story going forward. Glarien is all the prequel books that sort of set up the universe and the world and push things forward. Now, specifically to your question, I was a big Tolkien fan. I was also a big Terry Brooks fan. I love the Shannara series. But what I really loved later on as I got a little bit older was his Magic Kingdom of Landover series. And I don't know if you ever read that, but it's this great series that's set modern day in New York and about this really rich guy who has everything, who finds an article in some like fancy magazine for people who have everything about a magic kingdom for sale. And so he buys it. And like he goes to the woods of West Virginia, I think it is, and and crosses over to a portal, and like he thinks it's going to be a scam the entire time, but he actually has bought a magic kingdom, but he's also bought all the problems that go along with being the owner of this magic kingdom. And it's this amazing story. And like for me, that was the first taste of something that I like to call fantasy creep, or urban fantasy, or just ways of grounding readers in things they understand and can relate to before they go into that big magical world. Narnia does that. To an extent, Harry Potter did that. Like for me, I think looking at fantasy and the kind of writing that I want to do, while I have big universes, I never want to try to out Tolkien.
Yeah.
So I don't look at it, I'm going to build this gigantic fantasy universe and lose people in like 100 different lands and 100 different kingdoms and realms and warring tribes and this and that. I want to ground it in stories that people can relate to and understand. At the core of it, and for those people who read White Ash, you'll see it's kind of a second generation immigrant story. It's about people trying to choose the path that they are going to have going forward. Do they follow in the footsteps of their parents? and their cultural experiences, or do they forge their own thing? How do those experiences influence who they are going forward and the choices that we make? Because I think, when you're 20, and that's kind of roughly around the time when the main character Alec is, I think a lot of us go through this period where we think we are just us, right? And like that path to adulthood, we have to finally either accept or reject the trappings of who our parents were, as we get to understand because especially when you get away, you get some perspective on like, oh my God, not everyone does things this way, or this was just the craziness of my house, but maybe I love that craziness. Maybe like I want to keep some of that for my kids or whatever. And so you have to forge your own identity. So like I love that as a time period in life, in the late teens, early 20s, when you formulate who you're going to be going forward. So like that's the kind of story that is always interesting to me. But specifically to the spark, this will go back to Tolkien and also to Peter Jackson, in that I was watching, I love the Lord of the Ring movies, the Hobbit movies. I think maybe there's too much stuff going on. Maybe
you could say
overexpanded
that
a little bit,
yeah.
especially as a filmmaker. I think you could cut down 3 movies to 2 movies.
Say that's
take a
another
tighter story.
conversation that we can have, that we can do a whole nother episode
Right.
on.
but like that's from a filmmaking hat, like from a
Yeah.
fan hat. Sometimes it's better to have all kinds of things. But if you want to create a movie in a world that's accessible, there's pace, there's all kinds of things. And I don't think those movies, the Hobbit trilogy, hit those marks as well as say Lord of the Rings did. And it was also expanding one book into 3 movies
Yeah.
versus taking 3 movies for 3 books. So like,
absolutely insanity. Like I said,
yeah,
that could be a whole nother topic of
and that could be
conversation.
honestly, that could be a studio edict. Like
Mhm.
we need another trilogy, do the hot,
Mhm.
like, and so that may
I
have been
think
the
that's what
conditions
it
he was working
was.
on. But all of that regardless, because I think the pace of those movies was not, for me as a viewer. Did I lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, am I back?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're
For everything
glit.
froze for a second.
Oh, you glitched for a quick second, but yeah, you're good now.
Yeah. Okay. So I was going to say, like, for me, that the pace of those movies was not put together in a way that was an immersive experience.
Mhm.
So often during points in those movies, I started thinking about things. And there was one dynamic that they introduced in this film, in the Hobbit movies, that was not really native to the book. And I think it was probably trying to get a little more gender diversity, because as much as I love the Lord of the Rings, movies and the Hobbit, it's an all male story. And when I
Mhm.
was trying to get my daughter to read it, she's like, "Where are the girls?" like,
Very true.
which
Yeah.
is a good question when you're
Yeah.
like 10 or 11, to be
Very
like,
valid.
I want to see me in this story and I don't see me.
Mhm.
So, like there was a female elf character that they put into the Hobbit stories that I don't have
Wasn't
any
that
memory.
what's her face from Ant-Man, right?
Yes, and
The
from Lost,
Lily?
Evangeline Lilly. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I
Yeah. And
remember
so
that.
like, and so they created this elf dwarf romance that was kind of shoehorned in. And that was what kind of just had me noodling as I was watching this movie and thinking about, like that is sort of an interesting, like Romeo Juliet kind of vibe. But it's so underdeveloped and it's not really intrinsic to the story. I bet there's a better story to be told with that. And so like that was kind of the launching point
Mm.
for everything that I did, is like, as I'm watching this other movie, I'm thinking about another story,
Yeah.
just like it's a spark, and you take a
Mhm.
spark and then you start contextualizing it with some of the things that you want to tell, and the kind of stories that you want to showcase and what you like to write.
Mm.
Because like my background, as I said earlier, was like I wanted originally to write romantic comedy, so I love character pieces, but I also love doing action pieces. So like this was a starting point where I could do a lot of different things. And especially setting that modern day, I started thinking, have I seen this before? I must have seen this kind of dynamic before modern
Mhm.
day. And I couldn't think of it. And so I said, if I can't think of it and it feels like it's something that there should be, I'm going to do that myself. And so that was it. And here we are.
Hell yeah, man. I love that so much. And I love the fact that like this whole thing came from something you didn't like. Like you saw
Yeah.
the relate it's like, but I think that kind of goes to the kind of creative process and the kind of the mind of creatives and writers and stuff, is that you saw this relationship and was like, I don't really like how they did this, but I see the seed there. Like, you were able to
Yes.
see the seed of success in that story, and you took that and made it into your own thing and expanded on, like I said, the good idea that was in there but just didn't get fleshed out. So I think that's super cool, and again, just kind of a testament to, your creativity.
Well,
But I
and just for, again, for the viewers, White Ash really has nothing to do with The Hobbit at all.
No, no, yeah.
Like, don't like
Just
it.
the
It's a
the
completely different
relationship
story. Like,
theme,
but
yeah.
there is a relationship at the core
Hmm.
of White Ash that was influenced by this. So I
Yeah.
think like those things are, because like, oh, I don't want to read this book. It's a Hobbit ripoff. No, no, it
Yeah.
has nothing to do
White
with
Ash,
that.
the
Yeah.
Hobbit sequel.
Yes. Yes.
But I'm also curious too, again, with creating this whole world and this, fantasy and the mythology and all that you're working with. I'm curious too what the kind of research process is for a story like this, because obviously you're take like we just talked about with, the Hobbit comparison, you're taking twist on existing things. And obviously, again, being the Thor guy, we got, Siflheim and elves and light elves and all this stuff. So again, I'm curious, what does the research look like for a project like this? Obviously, I'm sure you're looking at Norse mythology, you're looking at other, sort of fantasy stories. So again, how does that, like, I don't know, it just seemed like such a daunting task. I wouldn't even know where to start, right?
Well, I think so. Going again to the, you can get lost in world building, right?
Mhm.
So you have to know what your true north is. And for me, it's the relationship of these characters. In White Ash, it's about, you know, finding your identity, forging your identity, and then, like, a more practical application is like, how do we get home, right?
Mhm.
Like, which, if you've read White Ash, that makes a little bit more sense. It's like, how do we return to where we came from or not? And so, like, everything is sort of based off of those compass points. So if you know those things, you know your themes. In terms of the research, for sure, there, like, I have a whole tab on, like a drop down menu of different references. Like, here's my, like, here's like one, like Elvish dictionary. Here's
Yeah.
another Elvish dictionary, and I'll pull some pieces from those things. Sometimes I will combine them, because, like, at the end of the day, you don't want to be pulling someone's things, their work specifically, right?
Yeah,
You,
obviously,
you
yeah.
want to you want
Uh-huh.
to get inspired by other things. I mean, I have lots of different Norse mythology breakdowns, and then, you'll watch some YouTube videos, and then you take what is the core, which is the mythos that and then you extrapolate on it, and you build something on it that's hopefully unique. It's your
Mhm.
take on the mythos, but you're using the foundation that is seeped in, lore as old as time, right? And so for things like that, like when it comes to the mythology of the piece, I really do, um, like, I have things open. I
Mhm.
have characters that, like, in our world, there are some characters who live for very long periods.
Mhm.
I have a character that was born in, roughly like 1918. So their speech pattern is predicated upon them growing up in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so I have a drop down of slang from those different time periods,
Mhm.
because, like, I want to pepper that character's speech pattern with some of those, some of those cadences.
Yeah.
So I do take a lot of time thinking about those things. The Glarien story, which is set in the 1970s, it's set in 1971 specifically for a reason. Like, there's some hints about some events that are going on right now in 1971. But, like, that's going to be germane to the story that's being told there, like why it's that year.
Mhm.
So I do base that in real time, real events. I do a little bit of historical research, because, these are real places I want. I love historical fiction that builds upon things and gives you the story behind the story,
Mhm.
and things like that. So, to give a little bit more weight to what's happening. And again, I always want this to feel like it's something that could be happening, in that strange town that was like one traffic light down the road from you, right?
Yeah.
You always kind of drove through a little quickly.
Mhm.
You know, like my other like little touchstone is I like to think of this in the vibe of Twin Peaks. You
Okay.
know, Twin Peaks meets Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
So like it just has like that town that's just sort of set away from time a little bit. And honestly, if you go into little coal mining towns or little industrial towns, there is this weird ageless sort of set apartness that those towns have because it's an industry that's been around for so long and so much of the infrastructure that has grown up is supporting something that was really relevant 50 years ago. So
Mhm. Yeah, and I think you 100% achieved that in this series, in the sense of, taking these myths that have been around, for hundreds of years, but adding your own spin to it and making it interesting and, feel like it's a new world. Again, being the Thor guy, I'm very well versed in, the Norse mythology and stuff. And again, I thought, your take on the elves and the trolls and all that, the giants, it felt new and fresh and exciting. So I think you 100% achieved that in your work. And I gotta ask too about Galarian specifically. And
sure.
you touched on this very quickly, but I want to kind of dive a little deeper into it. Something that I really love about the book is in the way that you structure it, and you've referred to this as kind of like Lost flashbacks, like how the show Lost would do their flashbacks. So I'm curious, why did you decide to go with this kind of flashback structure in order to tell this story? I'm sure that it's something we'll find out in issue 3, but again, like deciding to introduce this young woman character in New York and having her kind of experience Galarian's life through these visions instead of just being Galarian doing her thing, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One, I was trying to not replicate, but understand what people love about White Ash,
Hmm.
right? When I'm doing a spin-off series. And one of the things that there's a lot of people who read White Ash who are not high fantasy fans, but like the fantasy world that I've built because it feels tangible, it feels real. So I wanted a way when I was telling Glarien, like there was one brief, you know, quick outline I jotted out that was just Glarien's story.
Hmm.
And I was like, this doesn't feel like it's part of the White Ash universe. This, like that's fine for these short stories. And I've told a couple of, I have one, and if you can get it through this Kickstarter, this hardcover of just 8 Glarien short stories. Glarien also just for your viewers is a little bit like I like to say White Ash is a PG-13 book,
Hmm.
PG-13 universe that these R-rated characters come to visit. Galarian's one of those R-rated characters, so her universe is a little bit more in that Game of Thrones vein.
Hmm.
Um, but when I was telling her origin story, it just seemed more interesting if I tried to tether it to some kind of reality that made sense. And honestly, I was thinking also long term, and this Rachel character will have some ramifications down the road in White Ash in terms of what's going on. So there is definitely a connection between the woman who's having the visions in the 1970s and Glarien the Elf Warrior 3,000 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was a way, in a sense, to continue Glarien's story and move it into the modern age. Um, so like there's a lot going on there, and the third issue, there's a lot more overlap between the two women,
Hmm.
almost like if you have like that veil between worlds and it's slowly being pierced. The
Yeah.
realities are shifting a little bit. So there's going to be some of that going in this next issue. And there's more of a feeling of like those stories coming together.
Hmm.
So, especially if you like that, I think you'll really enjoy it in this third book. And one of the things I like to do in these Kickstarter stories is I also have the luxury of space,
Hmm.
right? So I don't have to be knocking something out in 22-page increments or 20-page increments.
Yeah. Hmm.
Like these are bigger stories, so I can take the time to weave the tapestry together of two, seemingly unconnected tales and, and parallel themes or storylines going back and forth between the two of them. That, this most recent one is 44 pages. So it's
Hmm.
basically two 22 pages
Yeah.
together. So you really have the room to tell two different stories.
And I love that too. I really love the decision to, tell the story in this way, flashing between the two different characters. I love stuff like that. So to hear that the third issue deals with that a little bit more, makes me super excited. But so let's talk about the Kickstarter really, for a little bit.
For
Like you
sure.
were just talking about. So what we've been talking about for most of this interview are White Ash and then issues 1 and 2 of Glarien. So the Kickstarter is going to be for issue 3, which again, even just hearing you talk about it right now, I'm super excited to get into and see this mystery that you're setting up again with Glarien and this Rachel character. So the Kickstarter ends on, let's see,
The 15th of November. I think it's
15th of
Wednesday,
November.
15th of November. Yeah.
So 15th November it ends, currently at 1,242 backers. And again, I can't wait for this third issue. Everyone that's listening and watching this out here, please go and back this. It is, again, issues 1 and 2 were so great. This is going to be a 4-issue series, you said, right?
Five.
Oh,
It's a
5
5
issues.
issue. So yeah, and like we always have catch-up tiers for everything. There's a White
Mhm.
Ash universe collection where you can get all of the White Ash and Glarien. You can get our other books. And I think that's something that's magical about Kickstarter. If you've missed out on something, it's easy to catch up,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Where if you see just issue 3 on the stands, especially if it's an indie comic, sometimes tracking down 1 or 2 are really hard.
Damn near
And
impossible
right,
sometimes.
and so
Yeah.
like you can always do that. So we have like issues 1, 2, and 3 of Glarien. We have a hardcover that has 8 short Glarien stories that will also tell a little bit of an arc in there.
Mhm.
I would say that there's definitely some relation between that little collection anthology of stories and what's going on in the miniseries. They're all related. Everything I do is part of one large map.
Mhm.
So even when things feel like they are unconnected, they eventually will pay off.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this will be a 5-issue miniseries. We have a couple other Glarien things in the works as well, because
Ooh.
people love Glarien.
Mhm.
Um, and we're going to see, in addition to this series, there's going to be a one-shot coming out some point next year, which will be a Glarien and Thane kind of love story,
Mhm.
one-shot adventure that also tells some more of that backstory. We have more White Ash coming out early next year. It's a very full slate.
Business is booming, man.
That's right.
Business is booming. I love it. And I think too, something I really love about this Kickstarter in particular is I love all the different reward options that you have on here. You have so many different ones. I mean, really for any kind of price range that, that you can fit into your budget, you have something for it. And I think that just goes to show like how much you, one, believe in the story, and two, care about your backers as well. And I think
Well, yeah,
that's just super important.
100%. Like, I mean, we've been doing this long enough where
Mhm.
I'm looking to build readers. So we try to have tiers that are somewhat cheap for people to catch up compared to say some other things you might find on Kickstarter.
Mhm.
And then especially if you're following me on Kickstarter, the first 2 days when we launch a campaign, we have a lot of cheap discount catch up tiers
Mhm.
and other deals. And then yeah, we have the higher end things as well. Just I don't know exactly when this is going to air, but if it's going to air
It'll be
soon,
before the Kickstarter ends for sure.
I was just going to say we're also going to be dropping, and I'll tell this in the show because I'll be posting this update later today. We're going to be doing 3 days of sketch cover drops.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you the White Ash artist Connor Hughes, who's my
Mhm.
partner and he's amazing, who's been doing a bunch of Walking Dead covers recently, did a Void Rival cover, and is going to be doing maybe some more stuff for Skybound. So like he's going to be coming out to join me at LA Comic Con from December, I think it's 1st through
The
3rd or
third, I
2nd through
think.
4th.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah.
the first through the third.
So yeah, so he'll be there all 3 days, and he's going to be doing 2 sketch covers each day. That will be LACC on Glarien #1 blanks, and we only printed up
Oh,
50 of those. So over the next couple of days, each day we will drop. We'll have the 2 Friday ones, the 2 Saturday ones, and the 2 Sunday ones. So like
wow.
if you're a collector, and I think those will be roughly $200 a piece, which is a pretty good deal for a sketch cover,
Yeah.
especially when they're going to be limited like that
Hmm.
from a book. So so we do the higher end things too, but I also still try not to make them too high end because
Yeah.
again, I want the people who love the world, who are collectors, to be able to afford things.
100%. And I mean, that is just so cool. Everyone, if you're in the area, make sure to head over to LA Comic Con so you can get your sketch. I mean, I think I'm gonna get one, man. I'm gonna make my way over there to get mine. But again, I really love this Kickstarter. I love this series that you've created and the world that you're building with it. You have made a fan of me just in this little bit that we've been talking here, and the, little bit that I have jumped in. And again, just everyone out there, please go and back this Kickstarter. I'm going to be putting all the links to the Kickstarter and all your other work in the description. So easy for you guys to go find it and, follow the links down there. But again, man, it's just such a great book. I'm really excited for it.
Well,
I'm
thank you so
excited
much.
for this third issue. And not only the third issue, but I'm excited for issues 4 or 5 and everything that's coming after. I know you've already mentioned that we have more Glarien coming, we have more White Ash stuff coming. But I'm curious, do you just have White Ash blinders on right now, or is there something else
No,
kind
I
of in
mean,
the works in the future?
well, we've got, Connor's actually finishing up. We have a side series, like Grounded Sci-Fi, in the series called The Game. He's finishing
Yeah,
up the
yeah.
third issue of that.
Hmm.
And so like that is an ongoing series. I'm also doing the How I Slept My Way Through College and the Tales from Freshman Year series. That's a 12-issue maxi series that I'm working on. I write this book called The Adept for Immortal Comics, which is part of that universe. And yeah, going forward, in addition to like all of those, there are one or two things I'm considering getting into, but you also don't ever want to expand too much. Want to
Hmm.
make sure that we're putting out the books that we're currently putting out at the quality and at a pace that I feel comfortable with. But yeah, there's a big science fiction, like Burroughs-esque, sprawling tapestry science fiction story that I may sort of start telling at some point as well.
Ooh, well, fingers crossed that you get to it, man, because that sounds super cool. And then to kind of just round things off, this is just last couple, fun questions, if you would, something
Yeah,
that
for
we like
sure.
to ask all of our guests. So I'm curious too. We talked about this before, and we've talked about this with other creatives as well, in the sense of, everything is research and or inspiration in some form or fashion. But when you're not specifically trying to research something or, reading something for a project, what are you reading these days just for fun? Like, are you a Wednesday warrior these days? Are you picking up books? Like, what do you like to read for fun these days?
Like honestly, so for me, I had a period, where I was a huge comic book fan that lasted till about 2014,
Mhm.
2003. I mean, 2004, 2003. And then I took a break. So like there's
Yeah.
this 10 to 11-year gap where comics were still coming out
Hmm.
that, for me, there's some catch up time. So like I've been going back, and what really excites me now usually are creator owned books,
Hmm.
because I like that singular voice on things. Um, there are plenty of things on Kickstarter I'm reading, but one of the things that I really have been enjoying is getting into Deadly Class.
Okay.
Just like I have some of those omnibuses,
Hmm.
and just the art and the oversized format, because it's something that's very different than what I do and the way that story is told. So I think it's always exciting to look at how something that's outside your scope,
Yeah.
right? And that you can admire the craft of and be like, I would never do this. But it's really fascinating to see other artists doing those things. So for me, like something like Deadly Class, which I feel like is a true creative vision, and the art and the pacing on it, it's again unique to what Rick wanted to do and Craig. Um, that I find really exciting. I'll pick up the next volume of Saga when that comes my way.
Hmm.
I just click those in the trades. So yeah, I mean, like I also don't really have that much time to read comics.
Yeah, I can
Or
imagine. I mean, you're making so many great ones. It's hard to
I'm
catch
making
up.
things so like I'll pick up one here and there. And I'm got an old Black Sad novel. I'm getting my way, working my way through. And there's lots of television, and I have children, and so it's like it's always balancing all of those things. And you read a little bit
Yeah.
here. I wanted to, I kind of, speaking of fantasy, diving into the Wheel of Time series,
Oh,
which I
okay.
had never read. My wife was a fan of, and so I'm also slowly working my way through that. So it's a little bit here, a little bit there.
There's just not enough hours in the day, man. I've been
No, we're not.
working through the Game of Thrones series for like 5 months now, and
Yeah.
I have 100 pages left on one of the books, and I'm just like, yeah, I'll get to it. I'll get to it
Well,
eventually.
and you'll probably finish it before he finishes the next one.
Oh yeah, I'm not pressed. I got plenty of time. I know that for sure. But Charlie, my man, it has been so much fun talking to you today. I am so grateful that you came and nerded out with me today. I've
Yeah,
again
for
just
sure.
had such a fun time talking about all your great work, nerding out about MCU and the kind of behind the scenes stuff that goes on with all this stuff. But at this moment, I want to throw it off to you really quickly. Tell the people where they can find you. Like I said, I'm going to be throwing the links to the Kickstarter in the description. But as far as your socials and all that, where
Yeah.
can the people find you?
So I hang out on the platform formerly known as Twitter a little bit, where you can find me at Charles Stickney. Unfortunately, I didn't get Charlie Stickney, but you can find me at Charles Stickney. There's White Ash Comic on Instagram. There's a White Ash Comic on Facebook. There's actually an at White Ash Comic on that platform as well, the one with the big X on it now. You can find me at Charlie Stickney on Blue Sky if that's your preference. I'm trying to migrate a little bit over there, so hopefully the community is going to grow there as well. So those are the major places to find me, and yeah. But check out the Kickstarter. We have a good I think 16 or 15 page preview, so you can see some of the beautiful art by Romina Morinelli, who is just incredible, who does Glarien, and there are colors by Finn Cran, who also does the colors for White Ash. So we try to tie those two things together. So check it out, and I hope to see you on the socials. And thank you so much for having me on.
Of course, of course. Like the man said, go read White Ash, go read Glarien. If you guys trust my opinion at all, and if you guys have been watching the show or listening to the show, you guys know I would never lie to you, and I'll be completely honest with you. And again, I really loved this book. I really love the world you've built. I love the characters, and I am just so excited to get more into it. I'm excited for issues 3, 4, 5, and everything that comes after. So again, I'll say it another time, just so I make sure that you heard me. Go and back Glarien issue 3 on Kickstarter. Do it right now. Turn this video off and go do it, actually, because it needs to be done right now. But again, Charlie, I got to thank you so much for being here with me today. It's been so much fun. But I think that's all we're going to have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening and watching with us. If you guys like this video, consider leaving us a like and subscribe. But other than that, I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay hydrated out there, and I hope all of your stacks are fat. We will see y'all next time.
I got this all day.